with the autopsy of Nathaniel Walker. I don't typically remember the names of my patients. By the time they get to me, they're nothing more than rubbery corpses on slabs of metal, so there's little need for introduction. Names are a formality saved for paperwork in the court of law. In the sterilized confines of an autopsy suite, they only serve to introduce pointless sentiment. I personally believe that corpses should be seen as puzzles, not people, and names interfere with that belief. I remember the Walker case, though. I probably always will. I was working alone that night. This isn't unusual for me, but the medical examiner's office had recently taken on a host of new residents, which meant most of my cases had become training opportunities for bright-eyed, freshly certified doctors. This case should have been no exception, but my shadow caught a bad strain of something from her 4-year-old's daycare and had to rush home, which left me alone with the body. I didn't mind it, mind you. You don't keep this job as long as I have without being comfortable around corpses. I started with the usual procedures, identifying the body and reviewing the relevant paperwork. Nathaniel Walker was found under a bridge a few miles south of the hospital. The police identified him from an ID in his wallet. He was pronounced dead at the scene and brought in for examination, though no injuries could be found. The only unusual thing the files noted was that his eyes were firmly taped shut. Not Scotch tape, either. Duct tape, multiple layers of it, snaking around the top half of his face. He wouldn't have been able to blink, let alone see. I set the file down and examined the area around his eyes. The tape had been removed, leaving marks where the adhesive had pulled at his skin, but the eyes themselves were undamaged. The irises were a vibrant, unsettling blue, the color of the sky in the eye of a devastating storm. I remember thinking that, contrasted with the veiny white of his skin, they looked almost alive. Like I said, I'm not a squeamish person, but there was an uneasiness in my gut that convinced me to close the eyes before continuing. I closed them. Even now, I'm sure I closed them. My external examinations revealed nothing. The patient was tall and robust, and even in death, he held a decent amount of muscle on his frame. He looked like the kind of person who tried not to eat out and jogged recreationally. Besides the tape over his eyes, there were no outward signs of any trauma or injury. Once I was satisfied with my initial inspection, I reached for the camera on my workbench. Documentation is one of the most essential parts of forensics. If you don't have proof, it doesn't matter what you find. I only looked away for a split second, but when I turned back, the patient's eyes had opened. Both pupils were constricted until they were barely more than pinpricks of darkness in an icy blue sea, and I swear, they were staring at me. The camera slipped from my hands and crashed against the floor. It isn't unusual for a corpse's eyes to open in death, but the staring unsettled me. I told myself it was a trick of the light, my imagination, and nothing more. I blinked once, twice, shifted positions, but the image never dissipated. No matter where I moved, the eyes followed me. I should have taken it as a sign to wait until morning, or at least ask someone else to take over. But it was a quiet night in the office. Apart from a few doctors and a small smattering of dutiful red-tape warriors, the office was empty. Any other pathologists were likely performing their own operations, and if I waited until morning, I would have to continue the autopsy in the presence of a chattering resident, so I chose to press on. I closed the eyes again. The camera's lens cracked during its fall, and the screen wouldn't turn on, so I set it aside. I was hurrying by this point, eager to finish the autopsy and go home to get the good night's rest I clearly needed. I shifted my gaze away from the corpse to change my gloves and prepare my tools, and this time, while my head was turned, I heard a sharp pop. It reminded me of a bottle cap opening or a balloon bursting, the unmistakable sound of pressure being released, forcefully. I spun around. When I say there was nothing there, I don't mean that my ears were playing tricks on me or that the eyes were closed. I mean that there was nothing there. In the twin crevices where his eyes had previously resided, only empty space remained. I screamed, then. I'm not too proud to admit it. I may be experienced, but none of my experience can explain disappearing eyeballs. The quiet of the autopsy suite, which I had previously taken as a rare comfort, felt insidious. The unease returned, coupled with the further terrifying notion that I was being watched. I looked around as though the missing eyeballs had just rolled off the table. Ridiculous, I know. It wasn't like they were marbles or pencils. They'd been rooted safely to Nathaniel Walker's brain only a few seconds ago. When I didn't see anything, I put down my forceps and started searching. I don't know what I expected to find. I scoured every inch of that tiny exam room, from the floors to the cabinets to the storage space above the highest shelves. Nothing. I wondered vaguely if I was losing my mind. Was this the inevitable nervous break I had been warned of by countless career psychologists? If it was, the best thing to do would be to finish the autopsy, go home, and get some rest. Eyes or no eyes. I approached the corpse again, stepping cautiously like a hunter stalking its prey. Only I didn't feel like a hunter. In that closed-off room in the basement of the medical examiner's office, it seemed to me I was the most vulnerable prey in the world. But I didn't stop walking. After all, what is being a doctor if not overcoming your worst impulses? I was within a few steps of the operating table when I saw them. Perched innocently on the edge of my workbench, frayed bits of optic nerve jutting out like wires from the tissue. Nathaniel Walker's eyes. They didn't move or anything, but I knew they were watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. My fingers twitched for the camera. It was broken, but maybe I could manage to snap a photo before what? They thought was ridiculous even then, before they caught me. They were eyes, for God's sake, and to my colleagues, a photo would just prove that I was a psychopath who turned my dissected patients into analog horror photo shoots. No, I had to handle this now, with my own two hands. I took a step forward. They were still. Another. Still nothing. In one quick motion, I scooped them up in my gloved hands and shoved them back into Nathaniel Walker's eye sockets. I felt around for something to keep them in place and finally landed on a set of surgical pins. I stabbed one through each eye, firmly trapping them in their respective sockets. When it was done, I dropped my arms and stepped back. Apart from my own labored breathing, I heard nothing, and there was no movement. I was just a doctor on the edge of a nervous break, watching a normal corpse with pins through its eyes. Even so, it took nearly 10 minutes for me to calm myself before I could continue with the autopsy. My hands were shaking, but once I picked up the scalpel, muscle memory took over completely. I collected samples for the toxicology report and performed the internal examination. Caught in my familiar workplace rhythm, I could almost convince myself I was performing a normal autopsy. Almost. When the time came to remove the pins, I hesitated. Unless a relative came forward soon, the body would be cremated. No one would care about this cadaver enough to notice 2 tiny needles. At least that's what I told myself when I placed the body back in the freezer with the needles still in place. I rushed home without a second glance. The death was a drug overdose, according to the toxicology report. The subsequent cremation went smoothly. No one mentioned the pins, and I never heard any rumors about missing sentient eyes. I thought that was the end of it. That should have been the end of it, but I kept seeing them. Every patient, no matter what their files said, watched me with eyes of piercing blue. I forced myself to stare, too afraid of hearing that dreadful pop to look away for even a second. My dreams were a paranoia-induced blend of fact and fiction. Most of them began on the operating table. Sometimes I was alone, sometimes with a resident. It never mattered. I would make the first incision, and my scalpel would lodge itself into the patient. No matter how hard I twisted and pulled, the blade would stay stubbornly stuck in that discolored flesh. Finally, I would yank at the tool with both hands clamped around its narrow base, and it would come free, always with that sickening pop. The exit would tear a jagged, gaping hole in the patient's sternum, and from that hole would come the eyes. They would spill forth in a flood of tissue and nerves, surrounding me on all sides until I was swimming, choking, drowning in that cerulean sea of hatred, because, although they had no expressions, I was certain they hated me. I would stab at them with surgical tools and stamp them beneath my feet, but the flood would be endless and unrelenting. Every night they buried me in that autopsy suite. If I managed to scream myself awake before my alarm woke up, I would feel an insistent, throbbing pressure behind my eyelids, as though something in my skull strained for release. I decided something needed to change around 6 months ago, when I jolted awake from one of my usual nightmares to find myself hunched over my bathroom sink with a needle 2 inches from my left eye. The remnants of an old sewing kit were strewn around me. I must have torn through half my closet to find it, though I couldn't remember a thing. In the mirror, my eyes were a bright, malicious shade of blue. My resignation was received with sympathy by my coworkers, though few of them expressed surprise. Like I said, a job like this isn't for the feeble-minded, and my eccentricities had become noticeable. I took their sympathetic words and mental health resources with grace, and within a week I was working at a new clinic a few cities over, somewhere quaint, with only enough equipment to handle blood tests and DNA samples. No bodies. Since then, my life has almost returned to normal. The illusions have stopped, and I've been able to work without interruptions. Still, I don't think I'll ever be able to go back to performing autopsies, because some nights I wake up from dreams I can't quite remember, to the ache of my nerves pushing against 2 eyes as they fight for freedom. On those nights, I grab my roll of duct tape and do my best to relieve the pressure. I never move from my bed, but I know with certainty that if I were to go to the bathroom and look in the mirror, my eyes would be a clear, crystal blue.